Hey everybody, I'm Mai. I'm a trans woman, a storyteller, and someone learning every day what it means to live honestly in a world that doesn't always make space for it. This channel, Whispers of Self, is where I share what it feels like to move through life after transition, the beauty and the cost of growing into yourself, the weight of being complex and authentic in a world that prefers binary and simplistic, and the ways philosophy and lived experience can meet in the middle to make sense of it all. Some of what I share will be personal, some of it political, and all of it will be grounded in lived experience and the research needed to understand a complicated world. In this episode, we'll be asking a hard question. Can a trans woman who once lived with male privilege still claim womanhood and feminist values as her own? So whether you're trans, questioning, an ally, or just curious, you are welcome here. So welcome to Whispers of Self. Imagine living decades rewarded by patriarchy's unspoken perks, taken seriously in your Zoom meetings, walking safely at night, your voice seldom doubted, only to later renounce that male privilege in order to live authentically as a woman. This is the journey of many trans women who transition after successful lives as men. It raises a piercing question. Can a trans woman who once benefited much of her life from male privilege authentically embody feminist values? And if so, how? The very fact that she had those male advantages is often weaponized against her, casting doubt on her womanhood and her solidarity with women. Yet, her lived reality now is one of having lost that privilege and facing the same sexism, and then some, that cis women do. This video will navigate the emotional and philosophical complexity of claiming womanhood after living as a man, exploring how past masculinity is used against trans women, how realness and authenticity come under scrutiny, and how both gender-critical skeptics and trans-inclusive feminists articulate what it means to be a real woman. We will draw on voices from across the spectrum, critics like Helen Joyce, J.K. Rowling, Matt Walsh, as well as allies like Judith Butler, Julia Serano, Susan Stryker, Imara Jones, and Zoé Samudzi as well, along with personal testimonies from trans women and cis women alike. The goal is a nuanced panorama of the cultural, political, philosophical, and psychological landscape surrounding trans womanhood and feminist legitimacy. So, let's go back in time a bit, further than I care to admit. I used to live a beautiful lie. On the outside, I appeared as a perfectly healthy and cis heteronormative boy.
人生中の一番大きい問題は
男で生まれたこと。
The world smiled on me as I walked in a man's shoes. I was raised in a loving, conservative Christian family. I played in the dirt, climbed trees, and battled my brother in Pokemon, just like any other young boy in the 90s. Before having a concept of gender or sexuality, I simply accepted that I was just a different kind of child than my sister and lived blissfully ignorant. But under the surface, doubts that a child would never dream to comprehend began to emerge. I remember 4-year-old me being confused why I had to wear an outfit that looked like what my dad was wearing, and it was not terribly comfortable, to church instead of what my sister and mother wore. I remember when 7-year-old me, upon hearing my family comment that my cousin that I was close to was a, quote, tomboy because she loved climbing trees and wearing sneakers instead of dresses and roughhousing with the boys, I gleefully announced that I must be a tomgirl because of my own developing opposite interests. I remember them laughing and dismissing the thought as not a real thing, and not understanding why. Why was something so natural to me met with such dismissal? Why was I being separated from the girls I identified with? As I grew, I kept noticing these invisible lines. In 2nd grade, I argued, earnestly and so very naively, for why boys and girls should be treated the same, because I could not fathom why I was considered so different from the thing that I longed to be. Each time I was told, you can't, you're a boy, it felt like a tiny betrayal of reality. A dissonance was brewing between who I was and who the world told me to be. In my teenage years, that dissonance only widened. I was small and late blooming compared to the other boys, soft-spoken and sensitive. People called me emo. Some assumed I must be gay because I was too much like the girls, even though I had only ever dated women. Honestly, I felt more at home among girls. I was the boy invited into the girls' slumber parties, the one who could be one of the girls, as long as I never really said out loud that I actually was one. Boyhood was a role I studied like a second language. I observed how teenage boys acted, their confidence, their roughness, the way they performed their masculinity, and I mimicked it as best I could. Eventually, puberty kicked into gear, and I grew, my voice lowered, and by my late teens, I was pretty effective at presenting confidently in my male mask. By my 20s, I had become remarkably good at the whole charade. I crafted myself into a man who ticked all the boxes. Stylish, high-performing, creative career thriving. I was often told I was attractive. I wielded the social perks of manhood like an actor nailing their part, and having my opinions so often respected as long as I claimed that respect. Yet inside, I was crumbling. I carried a gnawing emptiness, a hollowness that no male privilege or professional success or romantic conquest could fill. Alone at night, I'd stare into the mirror and I'd feel a jolt of alienation. Yes, the face looking back was handsome, but not mine. I grew to hate my body, to feel an inexplicable aversion to my own reflection. It was a weird feeling, really, because though I could register this body as my own, it felt heavy, as if I were truly small and just like controlling it from the inside a control room. Out in the world, I projected confidence, but in truth, I was miserable. Depression and self-destructive behaviors crept in. I started drinking too much, as if I could dull the constant ache of living a life that didn't feel real. I had friends surrounding me. I was seen by many and admired even by some, but none really knew me. I was loved, but it was a love directed at a mask that I wore, not the soul suffocating underneath. The cracks in my facade finally burst open when I met the person who is now my partner. Love has a way of disarming you, of stripping you down to truth. He saw through me, and for one terrifying, liberating moment, I allowed myself to say it. I told her the secret that I had been harboring all my life, that I was not the man I appeared to be. In that instant, decades of carefully constructed masculinity detonated, or as many other trans women like to call it, my egg cracked. The perfect life that I had as a man, the success, the comfort, it all suddenly felt like a house of cards that had just been blown away. I realized with blinding clarity what had been wrong for so long, that I was a woman, pretending to live as a man. The beautiful lie was exposed. And now I was left standing in the ruins, asking, what remains of me when I stop pretending? Who am I, really, when the man that I portrayed is gone? Coming out as a trans woman felt like stepping into a harsh spotlight. Not only did I have to face my own fears, I suddenly felt the gaze of an entire skeptical world on me. A gaze that said, really? You think you can just become a woman after living as a man? Who do you think you are? In my mind, I heard the voices of all the gender-critical critics like Helen Joyce and J.K. Rowling, or the other men like Matt Walsh. They all seemed to be lining up to interrogate me. I turned their arguments on myself. I brutally tested my own resolve. Hadn't I enjoyed the unearned perks of male socialization? Didn't I really benefit from being seen as a confident young man? These voices insisted that this ingrained privilege can never be shed, that someone like me is essentially an infiltrator, a man play-acting as a woman and trying to sneak into the sisterhood. Helen Joyce's words echoed in my head. Trans women are male. No amount of transition can undo the formative experience of being born and raised male. J.K. Rowling wrote that allowing any man who believes or feels he is a woman into women's spaces endangers those natal women. In her view, I was just any man, deluding myself and others. And I did have to ask myself, was that true? After all, I had lived over 3 decades as that man. Was I an imposter? Was my womanhood a lie even more unforgivable than the one I lived before? For trans women, the experience of growing up presumed male is often very different from the narrative gender-critical activists paint. While gender-critical voices argue that trans women's male socialization gives them an ingrained privilege and disqualifies them from womanhood, trans women often recall that upbringing as a time of alienation and trauma. Author and activist Julia Serano, a trans woman who lived as a male into adulthood, pointedly described male socialization as a form of forced conversion. For trans females or feminine people, male socialization was our forced conversion therapy. It wasn't what we wanted, but it was thrusted upon us anyway. Far from eagerly soaking up patriarchal benefits, many trans girls, though seen by others as boys, felt like they were play acting under duress. They report pretending to be boys out of fear of survival, waiting until a safe moment to finally escape that imposed identity. In Serano's words, some of us pretended to go along with it out of fear until we were finally in a place that we could safely escape it. This reframes male socialization not as a privilege gladly wielded, but as a burden endured often with significant psychological cost. Gender-critical figures nonetheless deploy male socialization as an ace. They argue that trans women, having grown up with the confidence and entitlement instilled in boys, cannot ever fully shed those traits. Helen Joyce bluntly states as fact that trans women are male, implying that this male biology, and by extension a male social background, must remain relevant to policy discussions about single-sex women's spaces. In her view and others, no amount of transition can undo the formative experience of being born and raised male. The underlying assertion is that a trans woman's past life as a man indelibly marks her, granting her an ingrained power cis women can never access. This argument hinges on the idea that male privilege leaves us a permanent gift, a kind of invisible edge that stains us no matter how we live now. And yes, when the world misread us as male, we did sometimes benefit from privileges tied to that perception, but those advantages were never innate, never an essence we carried within. They belonged to the mask that we were forced to wear. The moment the mask comes off, the gift vanishes, often brutally so. Trans women do not smuggle male privilege into womanhood. If anything, we trade the comfort of it for the clarity of truth. Just as cis women are not less real if their pathways into womanhood lack certain mentors or protections, trans women are not less real because our path passed unwillingly through manhood. Womanhood is not a prize for purity. It is a lived, evolving reality, and every woman's is shaped by different circumstances. Trans women themselves have a more nuanced take. Many, especially those who have transitioned later in life, do acknowledge having benefited from male privilege to some extent, but they also speak to losing that privilege and genuinely transforming their outlook. In her memoir, Whipping Girl, Julia Serano recounts her own experience of having male privilege and then watching it evaporate once she began living openly as a woman. She notes that not all trans women share identical histories. Some transition very young and effectively grow up as girls, never enjoying adult male privilege. Others, like Serano and myself, transition later and consciously work to unlearn male pattern behavior. An important feminist purpose of discussing male privilege is to examine how society favors men. Serano wryly observes that anti-trans activists who constantly harp about trans women's real or imagined male privilege, while ignoring their own cisgender privilege, are using the concept in bad faith, merely using the concept in order to delegitimize trans women's identities and lived experiences as women. In short, the male socialization argument is weaponized to cast trans women as permanent infiltrators rather than people who can grow and change. Indeed, many trans women describe their past masculinity as a costume they were forced to wear, not a reflection of inner reality. A trans woman named Kira wrote that she had consciously decided to give away all the privileges of her patriarchal heteronormative life in order to transition. Having been on both sides of the gender divide, she says, "I lived as a man, and now I live as a woman. I know what it feels like on both poles. I know how it feels when you are only an object that doesn't have the right to speak freely." Her words highlight a very painful truth. What gender-critical voices often call male socialization often feels to trans women like a period of profound disempowerment, followed by a loss of social power after transitioning. In place of male privilege often comes the shock of sexism. When I began my transition, I experienced objectification for the first time. Kara goes on to say, people around you perceive you only as an image or an object. They don't care about you or your feelings. You are only a toy to them. This before and after perspective, uniquely equipping trans women to understand gender depression, arguably makes them strong feminists, not fraudulent ones. As Serano points out, if a young girl were forced against her will to live as a boy for years before coming out as female, most of us would accept her womanhood. Indeed, the forced into boyhood scenario is exactly how many trans women describe their childhoods. The feminist implication, a past life under patriarchy, does not invalidate one's womanhood. If anything, overcoming that imposed masculinity can forge a keen awareness of sexism's injustices. One of the most emotionally fraught experiences that trans women describe is the precarious nature of a conditional acceptance, being treated like any other woman in daily life until someone discovers their trans status. In that moment, acceptance can turn to hostility in a heartbeat. This dynamic reveals the cultural obsession with realness, the idea that a trans woman is only a real woman if nobody knows that she is trans. The instant that she is found out, some people effectively revoke her woman card and treat her as an imposter. Consider the recent story of Amy Toms, a 22-year-old cisgender, meaning non-trans, woman in Connecticut. In 2016, she was just washing her hands in a Walmart women's restroom when a stranger took offense to her short hair and baseball cap. The woman snarled at Amy, "You're disgusting. You don't belong here," apparently assuming Amy was a trans woman. Amy was stunned, thus realizing that that stranger saw her as a man intruding into a woman's space. In a Facebook post about the incident, Amy reflected, experiencing that kind of harassment firsthand, saying, "I cannot fathom the discrimination that trans people must face in a lifetime." Can you imagine going out every day and having people tell you you should not be who you are, or that people will not accept you as who you are? Her experience of sudden misgendering, being seen as a man, however mistakenly, gave her a visceral glimpse into trans women's reality. Ironically, these bathroom confrontations are fueled by the myth that trans women endanger others. Yet, in practice, it is women, cis, trans, or the spectrum, who don't fit gender norms that get harassed. As Fox magazine noted, the current hysteria over bathrooms has led to women, trans or not, getting harassed in bathrooms, which is, on top of plain awful, ironic. The very thing that anti-trans activists claim to prevent, women being unsafe in restrooms, is happening to women because of their anti-trans policing. This underscores how realness is a double-edged sword. Passing convincingly as a female may grant trans women temporary safety from overt prejudice, essentially conditional inclusion in the sisterhood, but it is a tenuous safety. Trans women know this pressure intimately. They must prove their womanhood continually, through appearance, voice, mannerisms, or risk being seen as really men. As writer Julia Serano observes, once someone knows a woman is trans, they may start hyper-scrutinizing her for male traits. If I were to tell you that a particular woman is transgender, you might be inclined to reinterpret her, reading any tomboyish or butch tendencies as male energy, assuming every time she asserts herself, it must be because of her deep-seated male privilege. In other words, a trans woman can be perfectly ordinary by any female standards, but prejudice will rewrite her every action as masculine once her trans status is revealed. The same assertiveness that might be praised in cis women could be seen as male entitlement in a trans woman. This creates a very cruel double bind. Trans women are told they must adhere to society's ideals of womanhood to be accepted. Yet, if they do embrace conventional femininity, trans foes accuse them of caricaturizing women. And if they don't, they're derided as men in disguise. Serano calls this the trans women as caricatures fallacy, where critics claim trans women merely turn ourselves into parodies or caricatures of women driven by male arrogance or superficial ideas of womanhood. This accusation conveniently ignores reality. Like cis women, some trans women love makeup. and heels. Others prefer jeans or t-shirts. Neither makes them more or less real. Yet the cultural myth of realness persists. The false notion that there is a single, tangible criterion of womanhood, be it anatomy, chromosomes, socialization, or appearance, and trans women forever fall short of it. That myth of realness is not only oppressive to trans women, it has always harmed cis women who don't meet society's narrow standards. Black feminist thinkers point out that the category of real woman has historically excluded women of color and others. Sojourner Truth's famous 1851 speech challenged the idea that frailty and piety, stereotypes of white womanhood, define the term woman. She, a formerly enslaved black woman who plowed fields and endured whippings, was told she wasn't a real woman because she didn't fit the ideal to which she famously protested. In modern times, Zoé Samudzi, a black intersectional feminist, argues that trans exclusionary views simply repeat old patterns of gatekeeping who counts as a woman. She says, if you oppose patriarchy, you must also support transgender people, because it is the very same patriarchal norms perpetuating hegemonic gender constructs, oppressing cisgender women, that enable transphobia. Thus, an attack on trans women is an attack on our collective womanhood. We stand in solidarity regardless of different backgrounds. In Samudzi's eyes, trans women and cis women are jointly harmed by patriarchal realness tests. Whether it's a trans woman being told she's not real because she wasn't born female, or a cis woman being told she's not real because she looks too strong, too queer, or looks trans. This pain of conditional belonging, the constant demand that women prove their womanhood, is something that cis and trans women both experience under a patriarchal gaze. Feminist philosophy has long wrestled with the idea of what defines woman, often landing on the idea that womanhood is not an innate essence, but a social construction and a lived experience. Simone de Beauvoir's classic line, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman," encapsulates this view. Beauvoir argued that femininity is a construction of civilization without a fixed biological or mystical basis. A female child is not born with a ready-made womanly identity. Society shapes her into a woman over time through upbringing, expectations, and norms. If being a woman is something one becomes, then trans women who actively undertake that becoming later in life are in some sense walking a path that feminism has always understood, a path of constructing one's identity amid social constraints. As my favorite philosopher Judith Butler notes, what it means to be a woman does not remain the same from decade to decade. The category of woman can and does change. We need it to be that way. Butler, whose work on gender performativity revolutionized feminist theory, explicitly extends this to trans inclusion, saying, we should not be surprised or opposed when the category of women expands to include trans women. In fact, they argue that securing women's rights requires rethinking women to include those new possibilities. Womanhood, in Butler's view, has never been a static club defined by anatomy or birth assignment. It is a political and ethical category that evolves as we recognize how gender norms can be reimagined. This perspective directly challenges the cultural fixation on a real woman. Butler suggests that who counts as a woman is a political question and not merely a biological one. In a 2021 interview responding to trans exclusionary feminists, Butler was even more forceful. Dismissing trans women as just men with a feeling of being female is not only wrong, Butler says, but willfully ignores the existential predicament that trans people face.
And those who say that the assignment of sex should be binding for a life are giving those initial powers absolute power to define who you are, regardless of the fact that you may well feel quite strongly, in fact, quite desperately, that this assignment is absolutely wrong.
Being forced to live as a man when you know yourself to be a woman can be intolerable. Butler says bluntly that if you are forced to live with that assignment, you can become suicidal, something I agree with from personal experience. It is not a trivial matter of preference. It is not a mere feeling.
It is indispensable for one's life. It's not a luxury. It is a way of living. It is a way of loving. It's a way of flourishing, and it's a way of affirming oneself in the world. And to be deprived of those capacities is a travesty. It's an absolute travesty.
In other words, living in one's true gender is a matter of survival and integrity. A trans woman's claim to womanhood isn't a casual identity choice. It is often the result of profound soul-searching and the courageous refusal to live a lie. Philosopher Katherine Jenkins and colleagues have argued that movement between gender categories is possible and should not alarm feminists. They note that some radical feminists define being a woman as belonging to the oppressed female sex class, and therefore claim trans women, having been born male, are forever part of the oppressor class. But Jenkins disagrees, saying, "We do not accept the view that movement between the socially assigned positions of man and womanhood is impossible, and don't see why feminists should be concerned either to rule it out in theory or to contribute to making it more difficult in practice." This statement from a 2018 essay co-written with Lorna Finlayson and Rosie Wordsdale reframes trans inclusion not as breaking feminism, but as continuing feminism's project of dismantling rigid gender hierarchies. After all, if feminism aims to free individuals from the shackles of gender-based oppression, why police the borders of gender so stringently? Butler similarly muses.
I don't even know who we would be without trans theory within feminism. So, we might want to turn it around. It's not like add trans to feminist, but why do we think trans and feminists are distinct or even oppositional? They've been connected, in my mind, for a very, very long time.
Butler highlights an often forgotten reality. Trans-inclusive feminism is not new. Trans and queer voices have enriched feminist thought for decades. At an everyday level, authenticity becomes a key virtue for trans women living their truth. Many describe transition as a process of shedding falsehood. As a trans person, you don't transition to become someone else. You transition to stop pretending that you are someone else. The clarity of living truthfully, even at great cost, is often juxtaposed with the fog of dysphoria and deception that came before. Amara Jones put it this way: trans people, just through our existence, show the power and resilience of change. We are creating a future less defined by gender roles and defined more by what we can create than what we can destroy. In claiming a womanhood of their own, trans women may lose certain privileges, but many say they gain something far more precious: wholeness. As Julia Serano writes, "Every single day of my life, people perceive and treat me as a woman, and I routinely experience sexism as a result." We have very real life experiences as women, and through those experiences, harassment on the street, dismissal in the workplace, bonding with other women over shared struggles, trans women earn and enact their womanhood in practice. They become women, in Beauvoir's sense, not by a magical switch, but by living as women and navigating the world as such. The cultural conversation about trans women and feminism has grown heated and often bitter. On one side, trans exclusionary activists speak in the language of safety, fairness, and women's rights, even as they deny that trans women are women at all. They paint trans inclusion as a zero-sum threat to all cisgender women. J.K. Rowling, for instance, positions herself as a defender of women and girls against an encroaching trans movement that she views as hostile. She argued that when you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he is a woman, then you open the door to any and all men who wish to come inside. That is the simple truth, as told by J.K. Rowling. Commentator Matt Walsh insists that sex is immutable and binary, and that trans women are simply men deluding themselves and others. Walsh frequently demands, "What is a woman?" as a gotcha, arguing that trans-inclusive answers define women so loosely as to make the category meaningless. He and others accuse trans supporters of denying reality. By casting the debate as truth versus delusion, they frame their exclusion of trans women as a kind of tough love feminism, protecting women and acknowledging biological reality, even if it hurts feelings. It must be noted that some cis women with no overt animus toward trans people still feel unease about inclusion. usually citing fairness in sports or trauma and rape crisis centers. Finlayson, Jenkins, and Worsdale acknowledge that certain feminists contend that there is a deep tension between the demands of some trans women to access women-only spaces and feminist concern for the safety and well-being of those born and raised female. These feminists often affirm the right of trans people to live in dignity and safety, yet balk at full inclusion, especially if it's on the basis of gender self-identification. The Verso article that featured Finlayson et al. Takes great pains to engage this gender-critical feminist argument seriously, separate from overt bigots who simply vilify trans people. The concern usually centers on socialization and embodiment. The idea that cis women, having been female from birth, have shared experiences of sexism that trans women, particularly those transitioning later, have not, and that trans women's male-appearing bodies, depending on where they are in transition, might pose risk in certain contexts, like prisons, shelters, and sports. Yet, after examining these claims, Finlayson and colleagues conclude, ultimately, they think this argument fails. They point out several flaws. First, if they imagine trans women as just another subset of women, like, say, white women, as a subset, it becomes dubious to prioritize one group's safety over another's. Why should some women's safety take precedence over that of others? They ask, especially when the risk allegedly posed to cis women by trans women seems to be purely theoretical, not supported by evidence, while the risk of trans women from cis men is beyond doubt. Indeed, trans women face well-documented violence, often at male hands. Steering trans women out of women's spaces does not eliminate male violence. It likely exposes trans women to it, or at least more of it, by forcing them into men's bathrooms, prisons, etc. The oft-suggested compromise of third spaces for trans people is, in practice, a non-starter. Nobody is actually seriously proposing to do them. And what it really means is use of spaces associated with gender assigned at birth, which, for trans people, may well not be only uncomfortable, but also highly conspicuous and therefore vulnerable to violence, or otherwise forego using gendered services at all. In short, trans-exclusive policies don't protect trans people or cis people. They just stigmatize and endanger trans folks while providing illusory comfort, at best, to cis women. Furthermore, even in worst-case imaginings, excluding trans women sets a dangerous precedent. The Verso authors noted that even if, arguendo, trans women as a group did not have a higher propensity for violence, a claim with no evidence, would we then exclude other groups of women who statistically commit more violence as well? For example, if data showed some subset of cis women had a higher crime rate, would we ban them from public restrooms? Or would we seek solutions that honor bonds of solidarity rather than resorting to exclusion? The answer, of course, is that we'd find other solutions. And indeed, all available evidence suggests that trans women pose no greater danger in women's spaces than cis women do. As The Guardian bluntly summarized, trans women pose no threat to cis women, but cis women do pose a threat to them if they make them outcasts. The feminist case for excluding trans women is built on hypotheticals and fears, not on material reality. It presumes safety and risk can be mapped onto male versus female, when the real axis is dangerous versus non-dangerous. If danger is the concern, then it should be addressed by behavior, by identifying and removing people who cause harm, not by blanket exclusion of women who are simply living their lives. Finally, enforcing exclusion would require invasive policing of women's bodies. Judith Butler has pointed out the absurdity of expecting people to carry birth certificates to use a public toilet. In practice, any ban on trans women becomes a mandate for amateur policing on the basis of who looks female enough, which inevitably harms cis women who don't fit those stereotypes. Often, women who are butch, tall, of certain races, or have medical conditions would be treated poorly. Remember Amy Toms and others being harassed for looking masculine? Such measures would reinforce sexist and racist notions of what a real woman looks like. As Finlayson et al. Conclude, given the lack of evidence of risk and the high cost of exclusion, including trans women in women-only spaces, is by far the most practical approach to take. It is better, safer, and fairer under current circumstances to err on the side of inclusion. Trans-inclusive feminists and allies counter gender-critical narratives with a mix of empirical data, philosophical arguments, and humanistic appeal. Sounds like a little bit like this channel. They maintain that trans women are women, not as a dogma or slogan, but as a reflection of the social and lived reality that trans women experience. Trans women differ greatly from one another, Julia Serano writes. Perhaps the only thing that we share in common is a self-understanding that there was something wrong with our being assigned male sex at birth, and that we should be female instead. That inner knowledge and the decision to transition leads trans women into a life as women, where they face a very similar kind of sexism and broad range of violence directed at any other woman. As Serano notes, I have been living as a woman ever since. I routinely experience sexism as a result. Those who would deny my womanhood overlook or play down the fact that we have very real-life experiences as women. The feminists like Serano, trans women's inclusion is not a threat to feminism's mission. It is a continuation of it. Like women, more generally, many trans women are feminists, she observes. Feminism and transgender activism are not incompatible. Forcing trans women into a separate group does not in any way help achieve feminism's central goal of ending sexism. Excluding trans women, in other words, splinters sisterhood and distracts from the fight against patriarchy, the real villain of this story, for the benefit of no one but sexists. Prominent feminists, such as Judith Butler, have publicly rebuked trans-exclusionary trends. Butler traces today's transphobic feminism to fringe 1970s figures like our very favorite Janice Raymond, noting that it was very marginal and often aligned with right-wing morality. Butler finds it embarrassing and hateful, and utterly contrary to feminism's ethos.
I don't think feminism ever sought to be about hatred or applauding hatred or circulating hatred. And it's one of the things that worries me most about the transphobic feminism.
As stated earlier, Butler often emphasizes that trans women and trans feminine thinkers have been integral to feminism all along. Indeed, trans-inclusive feminism points out that feminism, which narrows woman to mean only cisgender, biologically female people, is ironically echoing patriarchal essentialism. It reduces womanhood to anatomy or reproductive capacity, the very move that patriarchy has often used to oppress women for centuries. As Serano quips, what could possibly be more sexist than reducing a woman to what's between her legs? And isn't that precisely what sexist men have been doing to women for centuries? Feminists typically reject definitions of women that exclude, say, infertile women or postmenopausal women. So why exclude trans women on essentially similar basis of anatomy or biology? It rings hypocritical. Butler argues that biology itself is complex and not neatly dimorphic as trans-exclusionists claim. But even beyond that, quote, the question of whether the sex you're assigned at birth is the sex you have to live with for the rest of your life is a question of freedom. Granting people that freedom is, to Butler, a feminist imperative aligned with bodily autonomy and self-determination. Trans writers like Susan Stryker have added a historical and theoretical heft to these arguments. Stryker's groundbreaking essay, My Words to Victor Frankenstein, from 1994, channeled Mary Shelley's monster as a metaphor for the trans experience, claiming the slur, monster, with pride and defiance. Lady Gaga would be proud. I am a transsexual, and therefore I am a monster, Stryker wrote with irony. Just as surely as the sun shines and the grass grows. He challenged the feminist mainstream to see trans women not as fake women or threats, but as embodiments of feminist insight, disrupting the naturalized link between sex and gender. In the decades since, Stryker and others documented how trans women like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were literally on the front lines of feminist and LGBTQ struggles. Johnson, a black trans woman, was a key figure in the Stonewall Uprising and in early gay liberation activism. Imara Jones, a black trans journalist, argues that centering trans women, especially trans women of color, actually strengthens all social justice movements. There cannot be Black Lives Matter without the centering of black trans women, because when not everyone has the same rights, the rights of everyone are incredibly fragile. No one is free until we are all free. Sound familiar? He notes that black trans women's experiences of total marginalization make them visionaries for a more just future. When everything fails you, you are more clearly able to reimagine what it would look like if things worked. She says, calling Black trans women the most visionary and progressive leaders in many modern movements. This intersectional view echoes a core feminist insight. The most oppressed can illuminate the path to liberation. And as Jones puts so succinctly, the future is trans. We have a power stronger than those trying to erase us, the ability to imagine our future. And what of cis women defending their own womanhood in the face of scrutiny? Trans-inclusive feminists see common cause here as well. Samudzi's quote earlier identified that the same forces policing trans identities also other Black women and police cis women's gender expression. Many cis women have faced institutions doubting their womanhood. For example, female athletes like Caster Semenya have been subjected to degrading gender verification tests because their natural physiology did not conform to someone's idea of a real female body. Semenya, who has a naturally high testosterone level due to intersex traits, was legally classified a female at birth and has lived as a woman her whole life, yet was treated by sports authorities as not woman enough unless she medically altered her body. Her case underlines how slippery and unjust the real woman test can be. Trans-inclusive feminists ask, if we condemn what was done to Semenya, and we should, how can we justify similar treatments of trans women? In both cases, a narrow vision of womanhood is enforced at the expense of an individual's dignity and identity. Statistics and theory aside, the lived experience of trans women navigating this terrain are often heart-rending and inspiring. Many trans women speak of the profound pain of having their womanhood constantly questioned and the equally profound joy and relief of finally living in their true gender. There are countless personal essays, memoirs, and videos in which trans women reflect on their journeys, grappling with dysphoria, enduring social erasure, and yet finding strength in authenticity. One theme that often emerges is the emotional legacy of being loved as a man but erased as a woman. Trans women who transition later in life sometimes lose capital and even loved ones when they come out. Friends, colleagues, or family who once respected them as men may reject or marginalize them as women, saying things like, I had all these accomplishments as a guy, a good career, community leader, but once I transitioned, those same people acted like I had become incompetent or invisible, or in my case, often said to be delusional. Such experiences highlight a cruel asymmetry. Society often esteems trans women before transition, when seen as men, more than after, when seen as women. It is an erasure of identity. The person finally reveals who she really is, only to have some refuse to acknowledge that reality and instead mourn the man they lost. That mourning itself reveals another darker layer of patriarchal bias, the assumption that the man was more valuable than the woman left standing. Misgendering, being referred to by the wrong pronouns or title, is a daily trauma for many. The Harvard Medical School's health blog explains that when people are misgendered, they feel invalidated and unseen. When this happens daily, it becomes a burden that can negatively impact their mental health and their ability to function in the world. Research confirms that routine misgendering contributes to depression and anxiety among trans people. Conversely, respecting someone's gender identity, i.e., using the correct pronouns, etc., significantly improves their well-being. This underscores that social recognition, the simple act of others saying, yes, I believe you are who you say you are, is indeed powerful validation. It's also just kind of a nice thing to do, and you don't have to be a jerk about it. As Judith Butler described, being denied that recognition is not just offensive, it can unravel one's ability to eat, breathe, move, love, to call upon the world to recognize you as you are. It is fundamentally dehumanizing. Despite these hardships, trans women frequently express that transitioning and living openly as women, though difficult, brought unparalleled clarity and peace. Trust me, I relate to that too. Many echo the sentiment, I'd rather be seen as who I am, and perhaps hated for it, than loved for someone I'm not. There is a steely courage in that statement that I love. Trans author Janet Mock wrote, I am my own woman. I am authentic. And no amount of coercion, no peer pressure, No societal expectation could persuade me to be anything or anyone else. Others speak of earning womanhood not in the sense of justification to others, but in the sense of active self-construction or deconstruction, building themselves into the woman or person they want to be. And there is something so quintessentially feminist in this self-determination. Trans YouTuber Natalie Wynn, more commonly known as ContraPoints, or maybe more quietly known to her fans as Mother, once quipped that gender is a work of art and everyone's the curator of their own exhibit. As an experience designer, I love that. In embracing womanhood, trans women undertake that work of art deliberately. They might have to learn things in adulthood that cis women pick up in girlhood, everything from makeup tricks to subtle social cues, which can be daunting, yet many find liberation in defining womanhood on their own terms. Julia Serano encourages viewing womanhood not as a scarce membership to guard, but as an inclusive umbrella that covers diverse experiences. If we strip patriarchy from the picture, woman doesn't vanish. It gets freer. It stops being a rank in the hierarchy and becomes a relationship to self and to others. Self-knowledge, I know myself as a woman, embodied living, how I inhabit and express that self, and shared recognition or solidarity, how we show up for one another. That's not a checklist of traits. It's a constellation people belong to by living it. We have to allow women to define themselves, Serano suggests, to trust women, cis or trans, to know who they are. Such trust is a through line in inclusive feminism, believing women when they assert their identities and experiences. Or as Samudzi said, my liberation as a cis woman is inextricably linked to the liberation of trans folks. This ethos recalls the rallying cry, nothing about us without us. We also hear powerful stories of resistance and healing. Trans women have formed support networks, advocacy groups, and artistic communities that affirm one another. In these spaces, the pain of conditional belonging is met with unconditional sisterhood. For example, Imara Jones's Translash Media and Janet Mock's writing create a visibility and celebrate trans narratives, helping to rewrite the cultural script. Each personal story shared of overcoming internalized misogyny, or navigating dating as a trans woman, or confronting workplace discrimination chips away at the myth that trans women are fundamentally different from cis women. Often, trans women's stories highlight the universality of many female experiences. The first time a man talks over you in a meeting, the fear of walking home at night, the joy of being called ma'am instead of sir, the annoyance of sexist dress codes. It is those everyday moments that one's womanhood feels both most real and, sadly, most tested. One particularly emotive topic is detransition, or returning to masculinity for trans women. Usually not true by choice, but due to social pressure or lack of support. The overwhelming majority of trans women describe transition as life-saving. Many say things like, "It's like I finally started living and not just existing," or, "Yes, I lost some privileges, but I found myself in the process." And you can't put a price on that. These voices remind us that the cost of living truthfully may be high, but the cost of living falsely is even higher, something many cis people too might recognize in their own quest for identity and self-fulfillment. In the end, it doesn't even matter. Sorry, millennial reference there. In the end, the question is, what does it mean to claim womanhood after living as a man? It invites us to rethink facile definitions of gender. Can a trans woman who once walked in the world with male privilege truly be a sister in the struggle? The evidence, in my opinion, philosophical, political, and personal, points to yes, she can. And more than that, she may bring invaluable insight precisely because of her journey. Her perspective straddles genders. She has seen patriarchy from the side of the beneficiary and the victim, and she chose the harder road of authenticity and solidarity. Far from being feminism's enemy, such a person might actually be feminism's ally, someone who voluntarily gave up male advantage in the pursuit of truth and their own justice. The cultural myth of realness would have us believe that trans women are forever imposters, painted by their past. But as we've seen, this myth crumbles under scrutiny. Womanhood has never been a monolith nor a closed club. Cis women have had to defend their womanhood against misogyny, racism, colonialism, and homophobia. Trans women now defend theirs against transphobia. The contexts differ, but the underlying fight, to be respected as the woman one is, resonates across all of those experiences, especially throughout intersectional feminism. And as Judith Butler put it earlier, to say again, we should not be surprised when the category of women expands to include trans women. Indeed, we should welcome it, for every time woman has expanded to include women of color, working class women, lesbian and bi women, feminism has grown stronger and more just. The double bind that trans women face, failing cis norms of womanhood and their trans norms simultaneously, is not of their own making. It is imposed by a society still unlearning its binary hangups. Trans-inclusive feminism argues that it is high time to break that bind. Quote, "As a woman, an attack on trans women is an attack on our collective womanhood," wrote Zoé Samudzi, a reminder that policing who gets to be a woman harms all women by reinforcing patriarchal control. And conversely, embracing trans women as women deepens our understanding of gender as human experience. It forces feminism to articulate its value beyond biology, to focus on combating sexism, not defining who counts as a woman. Ultimately, the measures of anyone's feminism is in their actions and values, not their birth circumstances. There are trans women on the front lines of feminist advocacy, fighting for reproductive rights, running domestic violence shelters, writing theory. And there are cis women who undermine feminist goals. Lumping all trans women together as suspect because they were raised male is as unjust as any other blanket prejudice. Yes, a trans woman's past may inform her perspective in unique ways, but it does not doom her to enact patriarchy. People are capable of growth and self-reflection, which is what feminism, at its best, encourages in all of us. Can a trans woman embody feminist values after living as a man? Many already do. They do so by listening and learning, by unlearning male privilege, by fighting alongside cis women against misogyny, by living their truth unapologetically, and in doing so, they demonstrate a core feminist tenet, that gender does not dictate destiny. A trans woman's life might span both sides of the gender divide, but her commitment to justice can be whole and unwavering. To claim womanhood, then, is not to recite a biological credential or pass a purity test. It is to live as a woman, to experience the world's treatment of women, and to stand in solidarity with other women, and to embrace one's identity with honesty. Trans women who meet that description have every right to call themselves women and to call themselves feminists. Their past lives under patriarchy, rather than disqualifying them, can equip them to see the system's absurdities with fresh eyes. And as they tell their stories of what it was like to have that privilege, to lose it, and to find their souls in the process, they contribute something profound to feminist discourse, a testament that authenticity and equality are worth the price, and that the fragile fiction of gender can be challenged and changed. So as we close this final analysis, trans women's fight to be respected as women is a feminist fight. It is about bodily autonomy, self-definition, and freedom from gender depression, principles at the heart of feminism. The journey from past masculinity to claimed womanhood is not always easy. In fact, it rarely is. It is often fraught with sacrifice, pain, and courage. But in that journey, there is also so much poetry and power. As one trans woman once wrote, "I found God in myself, and I loved her so fiercely." Trans women, like all women, seek to love themselves fiercely in a world that sometimes insists that they shouldn't even exist. So, in asserting, "Yes, I am a woman," against all odds, they embody perhaps the most feminist value of all, the refusal to let others define your worth or your identity based on your gender. And in that courageous refusal, there is room for a new, stronger sisterhood, one that truly leaves no woman behind. And so to close us out, I want to thank you once again for sticking around through another very long video. I swear I had intended on making these shorter. These are very heavy topics, and I'm just learning so much in this process. And so, yeah, as long as people continue to watch them, I guess they'll just take on the length and life that they're meant to. I learned a lot from people's input in our last video, both positive and critical. I'd love to see more of that in the comment sections. Please continue to watch these videos and let me know how you feel. Don't forget to like and subscribe because it really does help the channel. And as I said last time, it just kind of makes me really happy because I do put a lot of work into this, and so does my editing team who supports me. So yeah, thanks once again for visiting Whispers of Self. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.